I'd taken a course in stenography, and that's what I did in there for 2 years, because they wouldn't let you go into aircrew in the first place. There was a Mountain View, a station, bombing and gunnery school, and I was stationed there for 2 years.
That's the voice of the late Mickey Heller of Toronto, recounting some of his war memories to Crestwood Preparatory School's Oral History Project. Heller was one of the last remaining Canadian Jewish Second World War veterans when he granted the interview in 2022. He was already over 100 years old, and he would pass away pretty soon after the taping took place. It may seem surprising that it took Heller so long, 77 years, before he would agree to speak on camera about his wartime experiences serving as an RCAF navigator in Canada and then overseas. But his own grandson, Aaron Heller, wasn't surprised. He'd been trying for years to push his Zaidy to share those wartime details with him. But time after time, Heller would deflect the questions about what he had done in the war, and instead direct his grandson to research the records of people who he deemed far more worthy of attention, Jewish Toronto friends who had won bravery medals, including one pilot shot down and imprisoned by the Nazis who managed to escape despite a broken back, or the merchant sailor who saved his cargo ship from blowing up in Naples, Italy, or those 300 Canadians who went back into action after the war ended, but this time to help the fledgling State of Israel defend itself from 5 Arab armies during the 1948 War of Independence. They were called mahalniks. Aaron Heller took his grandfather's advice, and his reporting is now a new book called Zaidy's Band. It's being published November 11th and debuts in Canada this week, just in time for Remembrance Day. Heller says he wrote the book before October 7th as a tribute to the generation of Jewish fighters who made the world a relatively safe place for their children and grandchildren to live in, and who would be rolling in their graves to discover the same unbridled anti-Semitism which now their great-grandchildren are encountering.
I think it offers a level of inspiration today and guidance for those of us who are living through our times now. Not to compare necessarily one-to-one, but to have the sense that it's never been easy to be Jewish. It's never been free of hatred against us. It's never been free of threats against you.
I'm Ellin Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, November 10th, 2025, Remembrance Week. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Aaron Heller is a journalist based in Tel Aviv, born to Canadian parents who moved the family to Israel. His name may be familiar to followers of the CJN because he's an occasional contributor, including a lovely story from a half dozen years ago in 2019 when his grandfather turned 100 and he took Aaron and the other grandchildren assembled in Toronto on a short side trip to show them a Toronto Military Memorial Monument. It's called the Flames of Memory. It's now outside the Prosserman Jewish Community Centre, and it bears the names of nearly 600 Canadian Jews who served in the First and Second World Wars and wars since and didn't come home. On the other side are the names of hundreds of Jewish veterans, including Mickey Hellers, who served and survived. Mickey was proud of helping to get this monument built in 2013, long before the Canadian government finally formally recognized the unique contribution which Jewish soldiers from Canada made to the country's military history. That recognition would come only in 2018 with a tribute by Veterans Affairs Canada after my own book called Double Threat on the same topic was published. Aaron Heller joined me just before launching his North American tour beginning Tuesday, November 11th at the Toronto Holocaust Museum. Congratulations. We're speaking as your book is making its way out there. You haven't seen a physical copy yet because of the mail strike, I guess, in Canada. But
Yeah, I'm here in Israel, so I've seen the virtual one. I've heard that it's arrived at some places in Toronto, and I'm going to be there on November 11th. So excited to hold it in my hand and talk about it in various places.
Well, our listeners and the CJN readers know you as sort of the eyes and ears on the ground in Israel during the last 2 years and before. And you have written about your late grandfather, Mickey Heller. But now we get to see more than 1,000 words. So we get to see a whole book about the man who basically kept most of his secrets to the end and was very difficult, perhaps the most difficult journalistic subject you've had to interview. Tell us a little bit about why it was so important to you to try to get his story out of him before he passed away.
Well, I guess it starts really from when I was a kid. It was really like a lifelong mission over here, and I've always been super curious about World War II. We knew that he'd served in the war. There was a picture of him in uniform at his wedding, but he never spoke about it. It was sort of like this unspoken thing, felt kind of taboo in the family. And I, having the curious journalist bug, always was interested in finding out what happened. And over a while, he rejected it again and again and again. And eventually I let it go and became a journalist. And then at some point after many years, I realized, I know so much about so many Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans. I've written dozens of stories about them that have been among the most satisfying ones of my career. And yet I still don't know anything about my own grandfather. And in 2011, right before he turned 90, I said, that's it. Enough is enough. It's time to get into this. And the next 10 years were basically this back and forth kind of journey of trying to discover what it is that happened in World War II for him and why he's kept it quiet for so long. And in time, I realized that that's not that unique. A lot of guys were like that. In fact, most of them were like that. And it's been very satisfying to sort of peel away at that really slowly and layer after layer, get to this really untold story of the Jews who fought in World War II.
So, for our listeners who may not have read your beautiful tribute articles to him when you did come to Toronto for his significant milestone birthday, tell us a little bit about the environment in which he grew up in 1930s Toronto, 1940s Toronto.
Yeah, well, he was born in 1921, so he was that generation where when the war broke out in 1939, he was 18 years old. It's like exactly service age, and that's what we often refer to as the greatest generation. He grew up in the 20s and in the 30s in Toronto in a time where Jews were really not a major part of the society. There was still a lot of anti-Semitism around. The Jews basically all lived south of Bloor in the immigrant areas, and he grew up in the youngest of 7 children, and it was tough. They were poor, they had struggles, and when it was time, he went off to war. And so I really knew everything about him pretty much until 1941. And I knew everything about him after 1945, let's say. But there was this 4-year window in there, which was like an empty space. He'd talk about his life to that point. He'd talk about his life after that point. It was that window there, which seemed like it was really significant for him. And as I learned afterwards, significant for so many others. It was life-defining, and yet a real hesitance to go there and talk about it.
Why do you think it just didn't go farther than a certain point with him? What did you learn that you now feel was his reason for being so reticent?
Well, I guess there's a mixture of a bunch of things. First of all, when it's your own family, a lot of times it's harder. It's easier to acknowledge with people who you don't have an emotional and family connection to. You can be more neutral and come as a neutral observer. And I'd sort of started imagining in my mind, what could it be? What's this great big secret that there is to uncover? And what I realized is that it's reflective of that generation, that they were all tried to be kind of like the strong, silent type, not talk about it, not complain, so to get on with it. Didn't give it too much significance. It's my generation that has more of an interest and tries to fit it in some kind of narrative. But it was obvious that whatever it was, for him and for those around him, it was something that was very significant. And it was something that sort of marked the path for the rest of their life. You'd mentioned at the beginning, a lot of them afterwards came to Israel in 1948. After World War II, they either couldn't settle down afterwards or they were looking for another cause. And a big part of the book deals with that as well, the mahal, the foreign volunteers who came to Israel. And it's really no stretch to say that without them, Israel may not have won the 1948 war. They really were incredibly reliant on those Jews and non-Jews who had World War II experience, and especially in the Air Force, where my grandfather was in Bomber Command.
Right, and we can just remind our listeners that there were 300 Canadians who went over clandestinely because it was illegal, just as it kind of is now taboo and maybe illegal helping a foreign army. But they had to sneak into Israel and risk being, I guess, put in prison if they were caught in the war. Now, just to be clear, your grandfather did not go in the second part. His friends went, his classmates, his chevra went, and people around that. Did he want to go to Israel? Did you speak to him about it?
As far as I can tell, he never did. His lesson from the war was, did it. I did what I had to do. I came back. I'm moving on, and I'm not looking back. But what's interesting is that, like, as I mentioned, I started this journey really as individually trying to find out a personal story, so like a family heritage thing. And then as time went on, it expanded to a larger story about the Canadian Jews who served in World War II, but 17,000 of them. And then it evolved to something even larger about the Jews in general who served in World War II, which are 1.5 million Jews who served. And anytime I use that statistic, people are blown away because when we talk about World War II, we're always talking about the Holocaust, about the 6 million Jews killed. People are just not aware that there were 1.5 million Jews who fought for the various allies. And every single battle and every single front, every single part of World War II, there were Jews there, no matter where you look at it, fighting for the allies. And not only that, 250,000 of them died in combat. So these are people who did not die in the camps. They died fighting for their countries. But they also felt that they had a duty to protect their fellow Jews. And one of the things before I really dove into this, my grandfather didn't say much. But when I did ask him why he volunteered in World War II, it was very simple. We got to get even with Hitler. That was his driving force. And as the dozens of other people I've interviewed over the years, I've heard that repeated so many times from so many different people.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your front and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
There was, why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Your book not only talks about your grandfather, but this band that you called it of people who he intersected with or maybe had gone to school with, who were part of Israel's War of Independence. Maybe there's one or two of them still left, and that's about it as far as I am aware. How did you piece that together?
Well, first of all, there are none left. I mean, there really are no World War II veterans left, maybe one or two, but at this stage, they're going to be 104 or 105 years old. So that's why there was also the sense of urgency. Throughout my career, I was a longtime reporter at the Associated Press, and I focused on Holocaust survivors. And I really felt a sense of urgency to get their stories before it was too late. And World War II veterans, it's even more so because they had to be at least of military age. So yeah, my grandfather and the guys around him, they really were these last witnesses to this era. And that's why it's been so important for me to get their stories. The connecting theme is my grandfather. And that's where the story starts. That's where the story ends. And through him, he's sort of like the storyteller. He's sort of like the connecting tissue, if you will. And through that story of trying to figure out what happened to him and his wartime service, I eventually got into three main storylines. The first one was this Dakota flight in 1948 in Israel, which had 5 overseas volunteers and was a crucial moment in Israel's War of Independence. And it hasn't been reported on before. It really is quite unknown in Air Force literature, anywhere else. Anytime I asked somebody in Israel, they had no idea about it, no recollection of it. But it was quite significant. And so that's all original reporting about these 5 foreign volunteers, 3 of them Canadian, who were named Wilf Cantor, Fred Stevenson, and Willie Fisher. And Wilf Cantor was a friend of my grandfather's. That's the connection that we made initially, and that's really what took off this whole journey to begin with. The second part of the book is focused particularly on the Canadian contribution. There's a similar theme to all these different elements here. I focus on what's been overlooked. There's been overlooked the Jewish contribution, the Canadian contribution. Often when we tell the narrative of World War II, it's through the American prism or through the British prism. And so the second part is focused on the Canadian perspective and all the characters there and their various connection to my grandfather. And then the final section is about this museum in Israel that I also stumbled upon back in 2015 and chronicled this whole establishment dedicated to the Jewish fighters in World War II. and that's the museum in Latrun in central Israel. It hasn't really opened officially yet, but it is there, and people in Israel can visit it and learn about this untold story about the Jews and their great contribution in World War II.
Is your grandfather in the museum?
It's an interactive museum, so they have different things, but they have a database, and he is in the database. I put his story in there, and I put in also those of all of his friends and all of his comrades. And the museum itself has got all various wings, and one of them is devoted really to that early part of the war, and the Canadians are featured prominently there.
Okay, so we don't want to give a whole spoiler alert, but this crash of the Dakota, you've been reporting on this in pieces, I know, because I've read your pieces in the New York Times and what have you, for a long time about what happened to this plane in the desert in Israel in the early days of the war, and these Canadians who died. I guess what you can tell us is when you pieced it all together and you found out that it was preventable, this sort of mechanical problems with the aircraft. Are we allowed to say this? How comfortable are you telling me a bit about it? I mean, that is sort of giving closure to a mystery that's 78, 77 years old.
Yeah, basically, I mean, this Dakota, I'm sort of being cagey about it because we'll find out the information in the book, but it goes along the same thing I was talking about before, the overlooked part of it, the mundane nature of war. And that sort of mirrors the experience of my grandfather in World War II, which we're always imagining all these heroics, but it's actually the mundane, the daily things that happen that are really what keep the war moving and what is essentially the core of the experience. And the same thing with Israel's War of Independence. We know all the heroics, and they're in the book. But even a plane crash, which seems like it was something just purely mechanical mistake that happened, it was very important because it reflected the climate of the times. I mean, these were people who were really a ragtag group of guys put together. I mean, I had somebody tell me about these planes, that they were basically like hunks of metal flying in the sky. And it's just amazing the odds that they overcame and the dangers that they faced. And I have all these statistics about basically in World War II, how hard it was to survive Bomber Command. And then when you find out afterwards, the people who fought in Israel's War of Independence in 48, it might have even been worse in the sense as far as the casualty figures. I mean, we're talking about a full 1% of the people who lived here died in that war. So what I try to do is tell a single story that's reflective of a larger one that captures sort of like the mundacity at the same time, but also just, how wild and crazy these years were, how dangerous they were, and how heroic the people who took part in it were.
Now, speaking about war and 1%, this book lands after 2 years of Israel being in its existential war since October 7th, where you lived through it and reported on it to us and others. How can you see the two types of fighting or the two types of wars and sort of sit with both of them? Where does it kind of fit into where your book was to where we are now?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that because when I first started this journey, I really looked at it sort of like as an ode to the past. I looked at it as sort of like giving honor to the greatest generation. And the original manuscript that I did was completed before October 7th. It was really just the story of my grandfather and his friends. Then what happened is, I don't know if it's, they say life imitating art or the other way around, but it just happened that I really feel like it became more relevant because even without planning to, as this war was going on and I was finishing up the book and finishing and adding the last parts to it, you realize all these things that are mirroring each other. And so I think the larger theme there is that for basically 80 years now, my generation, maybe the generation before me, we sort of lived in this anomaly of Jewish history as we sort of had this situation where we had a Jewish state where generally was not under existential threat. I mean, Israel's had a lot of problems, had a lot of terrorism, but it hasn't had an existential threat. And Judaism in the world, too. Jews have lived a relatively, especially in historical perspective, very, very anti-Semitism free compared to history. And now all of a sudden we're snapped back to these same insecurities that the characters in the book had in the 1940s. So in a way, what we've had the last 2 years here, we've never felt anything like that before in our lifetime. But working on the book reminded me that we have felt similar things in the past, and that gives you a little bit more, I guess, a little bit more courage to stand in the face of it and say that we'll get through it.
Now, your book is in English about Canadians, but you're in Israel. You may be aware that there has been an effort for many months now by a certain group in Canada to list all the Canadians who served in the IDF during the last 2 years and dox them and taking most of their information from our reporting, as they have. And basically, Israel soldiers now, there's a report, the Hind Raja Foundation in England is trying to make Israeli soldiers arrested wherever they land, or ex-Israeli soldiers wherever they land. So being an Israeli part of the IDF has become a hugely bad thing. Here comes your book and talks about Canadians who did the exact same thing, and the Israeli government ignored them for 60 years too. That we have to say. They didn't really elevate their service in the same level as their own people. They didn't give them a medal. They weren't recognized, nothing for years. So, I mean, you said it's an inspiration, but, being an IDF soldier today is a bad word, and your book says it's a good word. I'm just wondering how that...
Well, first of all, I don't know if these people who do that list are watching your show, because that means they're going to add me to the list.
Oh, they watch.
Okay, so there you go. You just got me on the list. Thanks, Ellen.
I didn't say you served. I said some people served.
Well, in my book, it says that I served. So if they read the book, they'll see that I did. And I served 3 years in the Army in the 1990s. And I'm very open about it and forthcoming about it and describing my experiences also. And that's another part of the book also, realizing how, in many ways, my grandfather's experience in World War II echoed those of his father, by the way, who served in World War I for Canada, and my own in the Israeli army. And so, we're not a very militant family, as you can imagine. And yet we find ourselves having 5 generations of Hellers in wars, in battle. And, that's just the reality of our existence over the last century. I served in the Army in the 1990s. I didn't have a war to fight then. I wasn't in a combat role. It affected me greatly, just like it did him, and affected sort of a bit of the direction of my life. But to me, serving in a military, especially if it's a mandatory one, it's not like you really, there's no news there. The news is if it's conceived to be bad to serve in the Israeli military, then that should be the same for every other military. And that's the same double standard that we talk about that Israel often has, and we sort of have to deal with. This whole last 2 years, there is a shadow of anti-Semitism overall, the reaction to it. And it's something that you just have to deal with. It's unfortunate, and it's kind of shocking in many ways to a lot of us, but it's a new reality.
Let's go back to your grandfather. Did he get to see any of the galleys or any of the early drafts of the book?
He knew I was working on the book. And the first publication I had was in 2019 in the New York Times Magazine. I wrote a story basically about my grandfather and about Wilf Cantor. And that's when I was really nervous about how he would respond to that. But, he came along and he did enjoy it at the end. He appreciated it and he shared the story and the pictures. I think his agenda was always to talk about others rather than himself. But he was very proud of being able to get the stories out of his friends like Wilf Cantor and Sommer James and all the other people who are mentioned in the book. He was very proud about the Canadian contribution to the war and about how they affected also Israel later on. He just was not the kind of guy who liked to talk about himself too much. And so I hope I'm doing service to him by using him sort of as our narrator, so to speak, or our connecting thread, because the book is not necessarily a biography of him. It's just sort of like through his window, seeing that whole experience and what a huge impact it had on the lives of him and all of the members of the Greatest Generation.
Okay, finally, this book is for a North American, Canadian audience, but it also has a heavy Israeli component. It lands as there's been 900 plus Israeli soldiers killed since October 7th, either on that day or in battle, and how the country has been going to the funerals and the levias, and it's a whole thing. And I'm wondering, what do you think the legacy of these people who were killed in the war is in Israel? Or do they not know about the Machalniks and people like your grandfather's friends who, some of them are on Mount Herzl too?
Well, in general, it's not a known story. The larger story of the Jews who served in World War II is not well known because the larger narrative was about the Holocaust, about its victims. After World War II, the focus in Israel was on sort of like the ghetto uprisers and, the paratroopers and all the people who were in the resistance, and not necessarily on those who fought in the war. And those who did eventually came to Israel, and then they became sort of like the icons of Israel. They were less concerned about those who went back to their countries. So I'd say that their legacy, I'm hoping, will be now more well known. But in Israel, it's not a very strong theme. What is a strong theme in Israel is this sense of camaraderie in battle. And if there is a legacy, I think, from these last 2 years, is that perhaps we had gotten accustomed to the easier life where we thought that it was sort of Israel was a given and that these ancient threats against Jews were gone. And this was a slap that woke us up and told us that, unfortunately, it looks like living in Israel, you're going to still have to live by the sword, and we're still going to have to serve. I mean, when I was a kid, there was always these stories about, oh, when you're old enough, you won't have to go to the army because there'll be peace. That's the stories they told us. There's even a term in Israel for the children of post-73. After the 73 war, it was like, all right, we're done with that. We can move on. And 50 years later, we're not there. And it's sad, and it's difficult, and it's caused us a lot of grief both here and in the diaspora. But there, I think, is a recognition that we're going to have to take up arms when we need to, and that's what's happened in this war, and that's what these people did in World War II as well. I hope that this book in some way is a bit of a morale booster after 2 years of really struggling through all this, because it shows that there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
And it's important that these voices are shown in this special niche in history, which is, it was covered a little bit by a Canadian professor, of course, David Berkison, upon whose shoulders your book stands in the 80s, but not nearly the new detail or the personal detail, too. Disclosure, people, I did help him with this book a little bit. I'm very proud to help him present it in Canada and to the world. It's an important history story that has not been told in such a beautiful way, and you've got to buy the book. And we'll put links and come and hear him speak in Toronto and wherever you can find him. Thanks so much for being on the CJN's North Star, Aaron, and good luck.
Thanks, Ellen, for having me, and thanks for all your help throughout this journey. It really is great to be able to share this with you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxime Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. You can find out more about Aaron Heller's new book and learn where he's doing some book talks this month by going to the links in our show notes. Our show is produced by Andrea Varsany and Zachary Judah Kaufman. Michael Freeman's the executive producer, and the theme music is by Brett Higgins. Thanks for listening.